Welcome.
Aha. There it is.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you to our senior pastor, Walt Dilge, our associate pastor, Rachel Tabital, for being here with us, and especially Pastor Rachel for your tech support. I'm Chris Salto, co-chair with my wife, Kitty Salto, of the Social Concerns Committee here at United Methodist Church, Westlake Village. And the mission of our committee is to present educational and advocacy opportunities regarding the social issues of our times. And it has included presenting a variety of book studies and webinars on topics such as voting, homelessness, and race. And our next presentation will be May 22nd on the refugee experience. But thank you again for joining us today. And we're very excited that Professor Gary Williams is here with us for this presentation on topics that are very relevant today and seem to be continually in the news. And I'm so looking forward to hearing his presentation as a parent, grandparent, and a former middle school teacher. And I'm sure his wisdom will apply to all of us. So I'll turn over the presentation over to Carrie Lewis, a leader in our church, who will now review procedures for today and introduce Professor Williams. Carrie.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks everybody for being here. We're looking forward to having you all here. As you can tell, this presentation is being recorded for posterity and for learning and reviewing as time goes on. We just wanted to talk about a little bit of housekeeping rules. We will be able to, and we'll give you permission to unmute, but everyone will be muted. We ask folks to put their questions in the chat box, and Chris is going to be monitoring the chat so that we'll be able to get the questions answered at the end of the presentation. We are very pleased and just delighted to have here with us Professor Gary C. Williams, who is the Johnny Cochran Chair in Civil Rights at Loyola Marymount University School of Law. Professor Williams was staff counsel for the Agricultural Labor Relations Board from 76 to 79 and staff attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation of Southern California from 1979 to 1985. Professor Williams was appointed assistant legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. And then he was there in Southern California in that position until joining the Loyola Law School faculty in 1987. Professor Williams has been at the law school for over 30 years, and we are absolutely delighted to have him here to talk about CRT, or critical race theory, and how to have courageous conversations with your children about race. Professor Williams, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for having me, and I really appreciate this invitation. And I think it is a critical topic for our time for a number of reasons. And the way I want to begin, well, first let me say this. As Carrie mentioned, I'm an old ACLU lawyer, which means I welcome free speech and any and all questions, including those that might be challenging. So please don't be shy in that regard. I wanted to begin today by showing a brief, about approximately 5-minute excerpt of a conversation between Sherilyn Ifill and Brian Stevenson. And by way, let me say this briefly so that people know a little bit briefly about both of them. So Sherilyn Ifill just recently, at the first of the year actually, stepped down as the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, where she served for 9 years. Ms. Ifill was the second woman ever to lead the Legal Defense Fund. And in that position, she pushed the organization to do litigation on fighting voter suppression, inequity in education, and racial discrimination. Being very, very productive, she was also, and I guess is still, a member of the faculty of the University of Maryland, where she taught both civil procedure and constitutional law, and founded a innovative legal clinic staffed by lawyers and law students that focused on challenging barriers to the reentry of ex-offenders into society. Leading scholar, in her 2007 book, On the Courthouse Lawn, Confronting the Legacy of Lynching in the 21st Century, is really credited with setting the foundation for modern conversations about lynching and reconciliation. Brian Stevenson is the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, which fights poverty and challenges racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. Mr. Stevenson, who personally I find quite amazing, has dedicated his entire legal career, starting just after he graduated from law school, to helping particularly the incarcerated and those condemned by the death penalty. He is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, which has won major legal cases eliminating excessive and unfair sentencing, has exonerated several innocent prisoners who are on death row, and he won a historic ruling in the United States Supreme Court holding that mandatory life without parole sentences for children under the age of 17 is unconstitutional. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School, and you might recognize he is the author of a book entitled Just Mercy, The Story of Justice and Redemption, which was made into a movie. So I'm going to show you a brief 5-minute excerpt about their conversation because it relates to the conversation we're going to have today. And in doing so, I do want to say that this was this conversation occurred in 2016, not long before the presidential. So let me start the video.
But, you know, as you and I very often discuss, you know, if you looked beneath that surface, you know, it was very thin on the top in terms of how we were engaging issues of race. And when I say to people, you know, who are so distressed about the moment that we're in now, and I'm distressed about it too, don't get me wrong. And in a minute, we should talk about what makes this moment different, you know, than what we've seen in the past. You know, people have almost forgotten. I said, well, when did Ferguson happen? You know, when did we see Walter Scott running in that park, being shot by a police officer in the back? We had a Black president when that happened, you know? And so it was very apparent that the problems were still there and that they were quite deep indeed and quite intransigent. And so I think people just wanted to believe that things could go more smoothly than they need to go. Now, you described this as a cancer that requires the chemotherapy of truth telling, which I just love, writing that down. I often talk about it as rot at the foundation and how we have to put our hard hats on. That's how I talk about civil rights work, you know, that we're democracy maintenance workers and we put our hard hats on and we have to dig out. And sometimes there's real rot in the foundation. And if you find rot in the foundation, you know, you got to dig it all out. You can't just paper it over, right? And spackle it. But in any case, we have to get in there and get the stuff out. What's the stuff that we have to get out in your view?
Yeah, I think it's stuff that we've just never acknowledged. So, I mean, I think about the history of this country. We're a post-genocide society. When Europeans came to this continent, we slaughtered millions of indigenous people. It was a genocide. We killed them through famine and war and disease. And we never acknowledged the violence of that invasion. We took their land, we kept their words, we made the people leave, and we never really addressed it. And to justify it, we created this narrative of racial difference. And that narrative of racial difference is at the heart of that rot. It's what's created the rot. Because it's that narrative of racial difference that caused us to create this constitution that talked about equality and justice for all, and then not extend those protections and lofty ideas to the majority population on this continent who were Native people, indigenous people. And it was that narrative that then allowed us to traffic millions of Black people to this continent. We enslaved Black people for 2.5 centuries. And I don't think we've acknowledged that the great evil of slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude, it wasn't the forced labor, but it was this idea that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less deserving, Black people are less human, Black people are less capable, Black people are less worthy. That idea, that narrative of racial difference, that false ideology of white supremacy, that was the real evil. And we fought the Civil War, and you've heard me say that the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war because that idea of white supremacy prevailed. Even abolitionists didn't believe in racial equality, many of them. And so after the Civil War, we then enter into this new era. We passed a constitutional amendment to provide the right to vote to Black men and equal protection, but we didn't enforce it because we weren't committed to eradicating that white supremacy. And then we see 100 years of terrorism and violence. And you researched this work where Black people were pulled out of their homes and beaten and drowned and tortured and lynched, as you write, on the courthouse lawn. And it was lawlessness. Our legal institutions didn't respond. Our government institutions didn't respond. Noble people didn't respond. Church people didn't respond. And then we get into the civil rights era, and we have this courageous movement by courageous Black people who put on their Sunday best. They go to places, they kneel down and pray. They are battered and beaten and bruised and bloodied, and yet they go. We pass the civil rights laws. We pass the voting rights laws, but the narrative of racial difference, the ideology of white supremacy persists. And you and I grew up at a time where, despite the Civil Rights Act and despite the Voting Rights Act, we still have to navigate these presumptions of unworthiness, of dangerousness, of guilt. I've told people, I argued these cases at the US Supreme Court. I'd argued a case creating rights for children. I was going around the country defending young kids in courtrooms across America, and I was in the Midwest. I had my suit and tie on, got there early. I never want to create any bad vibe in court. You know what that's about. Sitting there at defense counsel's table, and had the judge walk in and see me there and get angry and say, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. You wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And then I have to stand up and apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Brian Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge starts laughing and the prosecutor starts laughing. And I make myself laugh because I don't want my client, who is more vulnerable, to be punished for my reaction to their bigotry. And so the client comes in, we do the hearing. But I have to tell you, when you finish a hearing like that and you're sitting in your car and you're thinking about the fact that you're a middle-aged Black man with all these degrees, with all of this experience, and you're still required to laugh at your own humiliation, you realize that this fundamental problem in America can no longer be ignored. That is the rot, our silence, our indifference, our unwillingness to talk about these structural and systemic problems. And that's why I believe we have to have a whole era of truth and justice, truth and repair, truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration. We can't fix this in a year. It won't be over in December. And no matter what the outcome of this election, we've got a whole era of work to do. And I think that's what we have to orient people to.
Yeah, so let
All right, did the sound go off?
Yes,
Okay.
everything's done. I think we got right to the end, and it's so moving and so powerful. I think we're all just silent, and it's just resonating with it. But thank you so much for sharing that with us, Professor Williams, and please do continue.
Okay. All right, let me get my screen back to the right spot so that I am addressing you properly. So I'm going to talk about the stuff that Sherilyn and Brian were discussing. And I'm going to start off, because that was the title of this presentation, talking a little bit about critical race theory. So I'm going to start that conversation with a bold statement. And again, I will emphasize I welcome challenges. My statement is critical race theory is not, has not, and has never been taught in any elementary, middle, or high school in America. And let me explain why I'm so confident in making that statement. I know several of the people who were instrumental in the formulation of critical race theory. I sat in on discussions during the 1990s as the theory was being discussed and developed by people like Professor Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Charles Lawrence, Mari Matsuda, and many others, all law professors at some of the most prestigious law schools in the United States. The idea of these scholars was to develop a way to more accurately analyze the role that race plays in racial bias in the formation, enforcement, and application of the law. Critical race theory is a way to understand and critique the law and its operation in the post-civil rights era described by Sherilyn Ifill and Brian Stevenson. Now, a disclaimer, I am not a critical race scholar. My legal research is far more traditional and practice oriented. But that said, let me give you an example of the application and the value of critical race theory. Social scientists have documented on various levels that the use of illegal drugs in the United States has been fairly consistent between the African American and white population in America. I will just refer to one study, but there are many. African Americans make up about 12% of the total US population, and studies show that about 6% of the African American population uses some form of illegal drugs, however that is defined by the law. That rate is roughly equivalent to the prevalence estimates for illegal drug use by white people. It's also around 6%. Why do I mention that? Well, because African Americans are incarcerated for drug crimes at a dramatically higher rate. And in one statistical study that was done in the 2010s, African Americans accounted for almost half of all prisoners who were sentenced for more than 1 year for a drug-related offense. What critical race theory does is to examine how and why such a result could occur. And people that I know who worked on these issues came up with some answers. The differences begin on the streets. Police officers who have discretion about who they stop, who they decide is suspicious, and who they detain make decisions about who gets stopped. And because of bias, both conscious and unconscious, statistics and studies show that police officers are far more likely to detain and African Americans and to suspect that they're engaged in illegal activity. At the next level of law enforcement, the charging level, where district attorneys decide who's going to be charged with a crime and for which, unconscious and conscious racial bias also at work in those decisions. The studies show that DAs confronted with factual patterns that are similar in nature are far more likely to charge African Americans than they are white potential defendants. And then those same biases affect decisions by judges, decisions by juries, and there you get it, right? 12% of the population generally, same use of illegal drugs, and yet 50% of those who are incarcerated. And what critical race theory did, and I'm going to speak about it in the legal context, is that racial bias, and in some cases outright discrimination, has important and in many cases outside influence on legal outcomes, and often in areas where you might not suspect. And let me share with you one of those areas just to, again, illustrate how this theory really works as opposed to the characterization in the press. Eminent domain, the power of government to seize property with fair compensation, I'll put that part in quotes, has often been used in various areas of the country to dispossess African Americans. Many of you may be familiar with the case of Bruce's Beach down in Redondo Beach. A Black family, actually a husband and wife, responding actually to racial discrimination on the public beaches, where it was difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans to go to the public beaches, purchased property and formed a basically a resort for Black people. And it was quite successful. And because the white community became unhappy about that, the government used the power of eminent domain to take that property away from the Bruce family. And only recently has the California legislature passed legislation to remedy some of the damage done to that family. If you can imagine beachfront property in Redondo Beach and what its value would be today, that's a substantial loss. Same thing in Santa Monica, a community where I grew up. in the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the Santa Monica Freeway was being developed, where was that freeway placed? It was placed right down the middle of areas that were predominantly either owned or rented by African Americans. And the city of Santa Monica is now also looking at perhaps in some way compensating the descendants of those people who lost their property through eminent domain because of race. So, and critical race theory helps to explain those things. I could go through a number of examples, but that's what it looks at. In other words, how do we understand that laws which look to be neutral on the surface wind up adversely affecting? And I've done it in the context of African Americans. It also can be applied to other racial minorities, certainly Latinos, Asian people, et cetera. Hopefully that discussion that I've just done illustrates why I'm so confident in stating that critical race theory is not being taught in the public schools. It was initially a law school theory, a very theoretical approach, one that was being developed at the highest levels of the American Legal Academy. It has, in fact, expanded to other areas of academic study and is now part of discussions in the areas of psychology, law enforcement, and other areas, and has filtered down, if you will, to the undergraduate level as well. But I am quite confident that your 6th or 7th grader, or that matter, your 10th grader, has not been exposed to critical race theory. It's been mischaracterized in the political discourse, and opponents have described it, I think, well, not I think, I'm going to say that inaccurately, as an anti-American concept that villainizes white people and indoctrinates children. Well, hopefully by my discussion of what it really is, you will understand, no, it's a way of critically analyzing what the law does, how it operates, and then ideally how it can be reformed to get out of the system, so to speak, some of the issues that have adversely affected communities of color. Now, to courageous conversations about race. I agree with Brian Stevenson. The United States has never really reckoned truly with its history of racial discrimination and exclusion. And this nation is never going to really approach its capacity for greatness until it does. I think the controversy that has developed over critical race theory is symptomatic of some people's aversion to do that kind of reckoning. Because conversation, let's face it, it's uncomfortable. I don't discount that. It's hard. And yet it's one that needs to happen if the United States is ever going to get beyond some of the problems that we have. Let me try to illustrate that by beginning with a little bit of a story from my own life. I had an excellent high school education at Santa Monica High School. My history teachers were so good, in fact, and so engaging that I decided to major in history at UCLA. Why do I talk about that? Well, we discussed at some length over the course of 3 semesters. High school then was 3 semesters, not 4. That's how old I am. We discussed, World War II, the greatest generation, the Nazi, the Holocaust, the liberation of the concentration camps, and all of that. And it was important, and it was inspiring, and it was a lesson in the greatest generation. I remember some of my teachers talking about the greatest generation and, the just war. And it was terrific, and I was inspired by that. We learned about the horrors of the concentration camps, the discovery by the Allies of what the Germans had done, and how the Holocaust really was a systematic slaughter of people simply because they were Jewish. But it was not until I continued my education in history at UCLA that I learned that the United States of America had its own concentration camps, euphemistically named relocation camps, and that thousands, literally, of Japanese American citizens and immigrants were imprisoned for most of the war solely because of their heritage and the color of their skin. Only then did I learn that the military rationale, which the United States Supreme Court accepted for this act of mass racial discrimination, was based upon lies, excuse me, about the Japanese presence on the West Coast. Those lies stated that there were Japanese spies, that they presented a danger to both the military installations and the equipment manufacturing facilities located on the West Coast, when in fact, ultimately, there was literally maybe, and the person who discovered it said maybe one instance of someone who was involved in perhaps in espionage. I also learned that those lies were motivated by racial prejudice, jealousy, and greed. Racial prejudice, hatred of the Japanese. Jealousy, because in particular, the agricultural community in all up and down the West Coast, but what I studied was in California, there was resentment because the Japanese farmers had outstripped their competitors in terms because of their efficiency and their knowledge. And the white farmers were jealous of that. And ultimately, when the Japanese were relocated, took that property. And basically it was sold at a song because the Japanese were told, you know, you have a month, 40 days to leave. And they were then sent to locations far from their homes, often in desolate, isolated areas of the United States, solely and simply and solely because of their race. So the story I learned about World War II in high school was at best incomplete, if not deliberately misleading. The moral of the story is that the United States ultimately corrected this injustice due to the relentless efforts of courageous advocates who uncovered classified documents. Don't get me started on classified documents that revealed the lies and deceptions that the General DeWitt, who issued the relocation orders, he and his subordinates knew that the Japanese did not present any major threat on the coast. But the happy part of this story, and the part that I want to focus on for our discussion today, is how that error was corrected. In 1988, the United States government officially apologized for the internment of the Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and paid $20,000 in reparations to each survivor. And that act came with the promise, well, I'm going to say the hope, but maybe the promise of never again. And within that tale of relocation, apology, and reparations lies, I believe, a lesson about the importance of courageous conversations with our children, our grandchildren, those that deal forthrightly with America's past. Because I believe that we ultimately did confront the terrible injustice done by that, I look to what happened after September 11th. When the United States was attacked, thousands of people died in the horrible attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and there were some who called for detaining Muslims and people of Middle Eastern descent in the name of safety. But that was most decidedly a minority sentiment. And President Bush said publicly and quite forcefully that the attack was the work of Muslim extremists and did not reflect the Islamic religion. And he steadfastly refused to do anything that smacked of the similar kind of action. Granted, excuse me, there were individual cases because the ACLU worked on some of them where people were detained because of their, really because of their religion, but we didn't have the kind of mass incarceration that some people were calling for. And the other thing that I point to with that is the fact that one of the most forceful voices in opposition to that impulse was the Japanese community. They spoke out almost immediately and said, this cannot happen again. It should not happen again. And that, I think, is reflective of the lessons learned by digging out, and used to borrow the phrase from Eiffel and Stevenson, digging out the rat and correcting it. And I think it was reflected again when President proposed his Muslim ban. If you recall, thousands of people turned out in airports, at government offices, and in Washington, D.C., protesting that this was unfair to have this kind of ban based solely on people's either dissent or religious beliefs. And I believe that those protests were born of the lessons learned. So the question becomes, and I think that's the question I've been asked to discuss also, is how do we have those conversations forthrightly and sensitively? And I think first and foremost, it's important to be honest. I think that it is really a disservice to children. It's a disservice to us to not be honest, to hide the truth. Children need to know that while the Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, it excluded African Americans. They need to learn that the brilliance of the Bill of Rights, with its due process and free speech protections, were not accorded to African Americans, to Native Americans, and really, ultimately through court decisions, not to any person of color. But that lesson can be coupled with the fact that ultimately we had the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, which corrected those deprivations, and that even though for a while they were not used to prohibit segregation, eventually the Supreme Court saw the light and declared that segregation was banned under the 14th Amendment. They need to know that women were not able to vote in federal elections, and many state elections for that matter, until 1920. So from the founding of this nation until 1920, women were most assuredly second-class citizens, even if I can call them citizens since they couldn't vote. But those errors were corrected. And I think that that's what is so important. And that is what you tell people as you're teaching them. While you teach them about the problem, you also talk about the solution and how we got there. So if I were to do that and talk about, for example, racial segregation, I can also talk about Thurgood Marshall, an African-American lawyer who, beginning in the 1920s, when segregation was still rampant, mounted legal challenges that ultimately resulted in Brown versus Board of Education. I can talk about the suffragettes, who began in the late 1800s to agitate for women's suffrage and ultimately won the right to vote in 1920. What's the lesson? Yes, we make mistakes. Excuse me. People are dedicated and forthright and willing to step forward and fight for the right. Those things can be corrected. Learning those lessons need not make young people feel bad about themselves. Something that I read so often in these discussions where critical race theory really is trotted out as the boogeyman. Nor do they need to be made to feel guilty because of their race, because the people who made the corrections that I just talked about, many of them were white. And that's part of that lesson as well. History lessons contain the seeds of progress. If we're willing to learn from them. Slavery was eliminated. Segregation is no longer the law of the land. Women not only vote, they're senators, governors, a vice president, and now soon a Supreme Court justice. Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. So it's an illustration. Yes, we should talk about the difficult issues, but we can learn from them and do better. So while there's much to be done, much has been accomplished. That progress, though, can only continue if teachers are allowed to talk about these issues, and if parents and grandparents are willing to have courageous conversations with their children and grandchildren about the errors of the past. Then we can move past them, excuse me, and make more progress towards the future. So let me stop there and invite any questions or discussions people might want to have.
Thank you so much, Professor Williams. That is just so, there's so many wonderful points. I just want to have like little quotes all over my office with probably the beginning of every paragraph that you said. Certainly, while much has been done, much more can be done. Your lessons for young people, about talking to young people, be honest and don't feel guilty. But if I do have some questions that I'd like to ask, because I think that will help clarify sort of the action steps for us. You talked about the fact that there certainly have been errors in the past that have been corrected. Would you say the next step has to be, because teachers and parents and grandparents and the adults in these young people's lives, because they must talk honestly to these young people, would you also say that these young people should be motivated to correct errors that they see happening now? Because we've talked about the past and how they were corrected and how folks stood up, spoke courageously to each other and made those changes. I think perhaps even the next step has to be to these young people, if you see something that you think is an error, it'll be your turn, right? To be that person in history that says this far and no more.
Absolutely. And I think the good news here is that as a teacher at law school, as a parent myself, I'm not sure how much, and a new grandparent, right. I'm not sure how much encouragement they need. The law student, again, I often draw on examples. The students at our school, after the, I'm drawing a blank for a minute.
The last election?
No. The murder in Minnesota, the name is
George
escaped.
Floyd.
Thank you, George Floyd. They were adamant about what needed to happen. They organized two, not one, but two marches through the downtown area from the law school all the way to City Hall, along with students from USC and UCLA. And there were literally hundreds of students in the parking lot of Loyola because we're closest to where they were going.
Right.
All of whom marched peacefully. They got a parade permit, had speakers. That was all done by the law students. We faculty and administration went along with them. They have been, and all of the students, I want to make sure that's clear too. It's not the students of color. We're adamant in the wake of George Floyd that the law school curriculum had to be changed to address issues that Eiffel and Stevenson were talking about. Because often, and I'm guilty of it as well in my evidence class, we talk about these issues in the law without talking about the influence of race on some of the decisions we have our students make. So when I look at what's happening on our campus and across the greater Los Angeles basin, I'm one of the things that makes me optimistic is the level of activism amongst our students of all colors.
Mm. One of the things that you talked about is that you say that parents and teachers and grandparents and other adults in young people's lives need to talk to their young people. They need to be honest and tell the truth, and they need to ensure that they don't feel guilty about their own race or their own culture when they're learning these things. So one of the things that my daughter is a law student now, and one of the things that she actually talked about before she even went away to law school is, if we don't talk to our young people, that doesn't mean that they're not talking about it, right? So however old the young person in your life is, however young you think they are talking about these issues. So, would you say that one of the things that you want to be able to do as that person in that adult in that young person's life is to sort of get in there and do that? We could call it counter programming, or we could call it being that influence. Is that your observation as well?
I think it's more encouragement.
Mm.
I have been, again, just really impressed by the level of sophistication and understanding. Now, granted, I'm dealing with law students, but I do work with high school students through our outreach program. And I will say the same, the level of understanding on many levels about injustice and about the need for change is already there. And so in some ways, I think our challenge is as much to encourage them and not to dissuade them. Because, for, again, going back to the George Floyd situation, I can think of situations where people might have been, kind of worried about loss of, this big mass of law students walking through the streets of downtown LA.
Right.
But the wisdom was to leave it alone. And they had, by the time the marches occurred, it was so well organized. It was beyond discussion. So I think it's as much to enable them to act on that which they're concerned about.
Thank you. Well, I see a hand is up. I just wanted to make sure that I got to these questions. It's 4:44. The time has just flown. I think, Ms. Bethune, your hand raising was absolutely what I needed to give me the reminder that now's the time for the Q&A from from our audience. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to see, can you, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Are you able to do that?
I am unmuted now.
Great.
Okay. First, I want to say thanks so much to the organizers of this event. I actually reached information about this event a couple of different ways. One, because I'm a colleague of Professor Williams at LMU. I teach in the Department of African American Studies there. And another, because of the work that I'm doing for the racial equity audit for the California Pacific Conference of UMC. So I know I'll see some of you folks very soon with the annual conference coming up.
That's right.
But also as a parent, also researcher on adolescence. There's so much here, and I was so intrigued by the title of this program because I would expect and kind of knew Professor Williams would say confidently, critical race theory in K through 12 or in young people's socialization, really anywhere, is not really what anyone is talking about, right? And so that piece of the title about having courageous conversations really kind of implicates something about what is not happening, right? There could be courageous conversations had, or we can just sit here and be preoccupied with whether or not what we're looking at is critical race theory, And so it kind of begs the question, what is it that people really have consternation about? What is it that's requiring courage in our practice and in the way that we carry on intergenerationally? Because Professor Lewis, as you illuminated, the conversations are happening. They're just, if it's not going to be intergenerational, if it's not going to be in our communities and in our congregations, then we leave young people to engage not just in the conversation, but in the struggle by themselves.
Yeah.
And you know, it's just, we always say, you know, that history will repeat itself. Well, we are looking squarely in the face of the reason why, you know, a refusal to have conversations. So I was wondering, you know, what is it that requires courage? What is that ambiguous set of topics that right now critical race theory, with its very, very sophisticated and technical tenets, right?
Right.
That's getting targeted. That's an easy thing for people to pin this conversation on, because it's actually quite inaccessible. It's very highly theoretical. So if you don't understand it, you can't verify whether you're talking about it or not. But what aren't we talking about? You know, and of course I have feelings, thoughts, understandings.
I think you might have a point of view.
You know,
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So your question to Professor Williams is, what exactly would you say is the part of it that requires courage? So what part of the questions about race are the things that are so delicate for what we're saying for our young people? Professor Williams, do you want to address that?
And in particular from a legal expertise, because that is something really important. That's not attitudinal. We're not talking about attitudes and feelings, right? What is it about the broader workings of the world can we distill into something that is digestible for young people?
Wow. Great question. I think, you know, one of the ways I think I can answer it, I think there's two parts. One is that there's some people who are afraid to talk about that history. And it threatens them, or it threatens their perception. A phrase that I've heard often in some of these discussions is American exceptionalism. You know, that we are the nation that is so exceptional. And talking about things like, you know, the Japanese internment or segregation in the South threatens that notion of exceptionalism. And I think that, and it's part of why I was excited to do this discussion, is that the reaction that is happening out there is an attempt to suppress some of that discussion in the public schools. I decided I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time, but I actually looked up some of the laws. There have been laws passed now in a number of states that purport to address quote unquote critical race theory. But when you look at the terms, what they're really doing is saying, you can't, teacher, talk about certain topics. And one statute out of Florida literally says, if it makes people feel uncomfortable about their race. And so and I can illustrate it a little bit further in an interview that I saw. It was a couple months ago when this was starting to boil up, and a reporter asked one of the people who was protesting, you know, what was she protesting about? And she talked about critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. And then he showed her a clip, and it was a clip of, oh, it is void for, I see the comment, it is void for vagueness. It was a clip of the protesters at the Pettus Bridge when they were attacked by the police. And she said, yes, that's the kind of thing that shouldn't be shown. And I think her child was in junior high school because it makes him feel bad. And literally, that was her rationale for saying, this kind of thing shouldn't be shown in my child's classroom. Well, the reporter said, but it's history. That's a news clip of something that actually happened. And she still said, that's the kind of thing that shouldn't be shown in the classroom. That's disturbing, because that's saying we can't trust our children to learn from the mistakes of the past. And I think it underestimates, for one, the intelligence of children. I hope that answers the question, at least a little bit.
It does sound like, absolutely. And it is it's fascinating that you are bringing that to the young people. And so it sounds as if you're saying that the fear, right, that requires the courage is the fear of our young people being indoctrinated into something that they apparently don't seem to understand very well, what critical race theory is. And so I think we can turn this conversation to talk about what young people are hearing and saying in the conversations they're having now. And I'm particularly taken by what you're saying is we are underestimating our young people. So in this manner, as a teacher, as a professor, as an instructor, what would you say is sort of the right level of introduction of these concepts? Because we know, I have said to my family, I learned about race not from the classroom, but from, the playground when someone threw a rock at my head at PS 37, right, in Queens and called me a nigger. So that's when I learned about it. That's what hurt my feelings. Not reading about what happened in the books, but from living my life. But I think that one of the things that we want to teach our children is we want to make sure that these things are age appropriate, right? As a parent and a teacher, how would you sort of introduce these kinds of conversations so that it's appropriate for young people? And would you have, I assume that you would have different levels of detail, depending on the age.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the miracles of today is there are plenty of resources for young people. And I mean, I again, in doing research for this, I took a look. You can find books that are appropriate for 5th and 6th graders that talk about Dr. King, talk about Thurgood Marshall, talk about what it is that they faced and how they dealt with it.
Mary McLeod Bethune, Madam C.J. Walker. I just want to get some sisters up in there.
You're right. Forgive me for that. I always got to give the sisters their due.
That's right.
But the resources are there, and the books raise these topics in ways that are sensitive, but that let children at whatever level understand what it was that people were facing and how they confronted those issues. The last thing I'll mention, since I stand embarrassed, I saw a wonderful book about Rosa Parks that was pitched to 6th graders.
Right.
And that's so just there to talk about these things in ways that children of whatever level are, ready to handle and learn from and to advance. And so it's why this discussion about what can be taught in the classroom. Someone said in the chat, the Florida law sounds void for vagueness. It absolutely is void for vagueness. Right. Now, whether the present Supreme Court will ultimately come down that way is another question. But one of the fears that have already been among the fears, rather, that have already been expressed by teachers in Florida is, am I going to get in trouble for talking about Dr. Martin Luther King and what he did?
Right.
And it is entirely plausible based upon the language of the statute. And, some of these provisions literally make parents like, what's the word I want? Monitors.
Right.
They can report a teacher, and get the teacher in trouble. So I think it's not difficult at all for people to have those discussions. There are plenty of resources that would enable them to do it based upon the level of the child involved. Again, I will also say, certainly by the time they get to high school, I think a lot of kids are having those discussions whether we adults are assisting them or not.
Well, thank you so much. I want to make sure that if there are any other questions that we get them through, because I know we're getting close to time. Chris, I'm not sure if you got anything separate from what I have. I think you've been incredibly comprehensive and really thoughtful, Professor Williams. So I'm not sure if we have any other questions from the audience or not.
I don't see any. I have a comment if there aren't any other
Sure.
questions.
Mhm.
Basically agreeing with a lot of what you've said about children. I think as parents, we all know that fairness, kids take that concept at a very young age. That's not fair, when they're punished. And also the feeling of the understanding of, they have some rights. So in teaching US history to 7th and 8th graders and, emphasizing a lot about the ideals of the country, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and other amendments that Professor Williams mentioned, 13, 14, 15, et cetera. They have high expectations for America. And when they learn in English, they read Farewell to Manzanar about the Japanese internment. When they read Anne Frank and go to the Holocaust Museum, and when we study, throughout the history I did through 1900, the slavery, the Civil War, the attempt at Reconstruction, the terrorism of the lynchings, the KKK, and the Dred Scott, that Black people aren't citizens, Plessy case we study of separate but equal. They get upset. And in my mind, if they're not upset, maybe I didn't do a very good job. Now, of course, they're upset that we're not living up to ideals of why we want to be thinking of ourselves as exceptional because we have exceptional ideals. But I never experienced or thought anybody was feeling upset with themselves, because that was then. And we talk about, okay, it's now. What do we do now? So to pretend that kids, she said, aren't smart enough to engage in fairness and talk about our ideals and where we're gone wrong and what we can do, is selling them short.
It sounds disingenuous, right, to say that, because you know them quite well. And I think Nancy and Tim Bonds also have a question. Did you want to answer a question in our last minute? You're going to have the last word, Nancy and Tim? Yes, can you unmute yourself? Oh, you can't? Okay, Pastor Rachel?
No, okay, I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Chris and Kitty, thanks so much for hosting this. Professor Williams, thanks so much for your comments. It was really informative for Nancy and I. I appreciate that. I want to mention something. You'd made the point earlier that African Americans are arrested more often for drug offenses. And I wanted to point out another piece of data that also goes along with that. You may already be aware of it. This one's posted on the Ohio ACLU site. It's a RAND Corporation report. Full disclosure, I work for RAND. That's why I happen to know about it. But basically what these researchers did is they looked to see if African Americans are stopped more often on the highway. Now, they did a natural experiment. They waited till daylight saving time changed. So you got the same traffic pattern, presumably the same cars going the same places for the same reasons. So there's none of those other special circumstances. But what they show is after daylight savings time changes and it's light and people can see the race of the car occupant, if you're an African American in Cincinnati, Ohio, depending on the year, you're 11% or 15% or 19% more likely to be pulled over, to be stopped in traffic. They stopped short of finding racial bias, but the straight statistic is you're more likely to be pulled over. If you're more likely to be pulled over, whatever happens next, you're now part of this legal justice system. So I wanted to point that out to you. I think this evaluation was done in several cities. This was one. The city of Cincinnati asked for this audit. So this was done. There are others. Korea, if this is of interest, I can pass this on to you. But it's an indication that, yes, if you're in Cincinnati, Ohio in those times when daylight savings times change and it's light, you're more likely to be pulled over if you're an African American.
Yeah, not surprising at all. And thank you for sharing that specific information. And I will say, I think that some of the inquiries like that one were byproducts of critical race theory, as people began to say, how can we have a system where the use of a drug is consistent across two different populations and have such a divergence in the number of people who are arrested and ultimately convicted? So I thank you for sharing that information. It is another illustration of why, and it, you know, as a teacher of law, one of the things I have to question every once in a while is, am I really doing a service? And my answer becomes yes, as long as I'm trying to help my students who are the next generation, because pretty soon I'm going to be stepping away from this, to continue to make changes that move the law forward in a positive way. And I think, you know, those kinds of statistics are going to help as we begin to develop training to try to get officers out of their unconscious bias, which leads to the kind of data that you've cited for us. So I thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Professor Williams, and thank you to everyone for raising their hands and asking questions and being so thoroughly involved in what we're doing here. Professor Williams, you are absolutely just been such a thoughtful, you know, and skillful person to provide us with the tools that we need to talk with our young people and to really discern what CRT means and what it means in our community, and then how we can talk to our young people and have these courageous conversations about race and racial issues. I want to thank Pastor Walt Dill, Pastor Rachel Tabutal for being our the senior and associate pastors of the United Methodist Church of Westlake Village. I want to thank Christopher and Kitty Salto as the leaders of the Social Concerns Committee. And we also want to thank you again, Professor Williams, for being here and sharing your time and your talent with us today. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right, before you go, let me thank you for the invitation and the congregation for being such a wonderful and receptive and attentive audience. And really appreciate it. And it was challenging and fun to do at the same time, if I can say that.
Well, good. We're glad to challenge you, and I'm glad that it was also fun. So we're just a little bit over. Thank you for staying those 4 minutes with us. Thanks to everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your weekends. And we have recorded this, so we'll have a posterity. And I want to say again, thank you so much, Professor Williams, and have a great weekend, everybody.
One other point before we go, sorry. Again, thank you also to Professor Williams for bringing your experience and wisdom to us and giving us much to think about and act on. And I appreciate all your time. And just want to make announcement that May 22nd is our next program, A Refugee Story, a first-person account. And our guest speakers is Addis Peterson, who came out of Latvia, spent time in refugee camps, and was basically forced out by Russia, you know, several years ago. So that is upcoming. You'll get more information. And can I ask Pastor Rachel for a closing prayer?
You sure can. I want to again thank Gary for his presentation. You don't know this, Professor Williams, but I have children that are half Filipino. And so I am regularly having conversations with them along the lines of what you're talking about. When they hear something that is questionable, and they're 8 years old, but they already hear things that are questionable, we'll have conversations on a regular basis that are along the lines of, well, what did you hear? What do you think about it? What does mommy say about it? And we have these great conversations that are about them processing the situation. And I think that that's so important when we hear things that we disagree with, to take the time to process it and to allow those young minds, even at 8, to consider what's right and what's ethical. So thank you for your presentation. Let's be in the attitude of prayer. Awesome and almighty God, we give you thanks for this day, for the opportunity to talk about what it means to have those difficult conversations, to engage in information when we recognize that we're not getting the full story and that we need to dig deeper, to look more fully, to pull our heads out of the sand and address what's going on in our world so that we can live into building the kingdom that you have called us to build, one where everyone has sacred worth, one where everyone's rights to live are valued, and that we recognize how we can continue to work to build that kingdom here on earth. Be with us that we have those courageous conversations and that we take part in doing the work that is needed to deal with the stuff that is just under the surface. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Stop recording.